5 years after the children disappeared, the school was no longer loud. The building still stood at the edge of town, its brick walls unchanged, its windows intact, but something about it had gone dormant. The playground equipment had rusted into stillness. The murals painted by former students had faded into pale shapes that no one bothered to restore. And one classroom, sealed, padlocked, and avoided, remained exactly as it had been the day an entire fourth-grade class vanished without explanation. The case was officially cold. Unofficially, it never left the mind of the detective who had first worked it. Thus is one of those stories that will keep you questioning yourself on what must have happened on that day of their disappearance. But before we head into that, please make sure you support the channel by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you don't miss the next case just like this one. In early 2000, a routine review of unresolved cases was underway at the county records office. The goal was administrative: digitize files, archive what could no longer be actively pursued, and close the book on investigations that had gone nowhere. Boxes were opened. Reports were scanned. Evidence logs were checked for compliance. One file, thick and dust-stained, refused to feel like paperwork. The disappearance of a teacher in her late 30s and 15 children, all 10 years old, from a locked elementary school classroom in 1995 had been classified as unsolved, no suspects. The phrasing was clean. The reality never was. The detective hadn't planned to revisit it. But the photographs inside the folder forced him to slow down. There was the classroom as it had been found, chairs tucked under desks, backpacks hanging from hooks, worksheets neatly stacked. A chalkboard message frozen mid-thought. Lunchboxes still warm when staff first entered. No blood. No signs of struggle. No open doors or broken windows. Every item suggested the occupants had intended to return. What brought the file back into motion wasn't nostalgia or guilt. It was an anomaly. Buried deep in the supplemental notes was a short paragraph that had never been followed up on. A structural assessment requested weeks after the disappearance. A request that had been denied due to budget constraints. A line that read, "Subsurface anomalies detected beneath central wing. Further inspection recommended." No follow-up report existed. That omission lingered. The detective requested updated blueprints of the school. The documents that arrived were incomplete, revisions layered over older drafts, entire sections removed during renovations in the late 1980s. Certain utility markings simply ended beneath the main hall, as if the space below had been erased. It was enough to justify a quiet visit. The school had been partially repurposed by then, used for storage and administrative overflow. When the detective walked its corridors again, the sound of his footsteps echoed unnaturally. The classroom where the children had last been seen remained sealed, untouched by instruction or laughter for half a decade. He didn't open it. Instead, he stood beneath the assembly hall. The floor creaked in places it shouldn't have. Sound traveled oddly, too hollow, too delayed. When he knocked lightly near the center of the room, the echo returned softer than expected, as though something below was absorbing it. An engineering firm was contacted under the guise of routine inspection. Ground-penetrating scans were ordered quietly, without press involvement. The results came back marked inconclusive, a term that often meant someone should look closer. Beneath the school, there was empty space. Not a crawl space. Not standard foundation voids. A room. Its outline appeared too deliberate to be accidental. Too symmetrical. Its walls didn't align with modern construction standards, suggesting it predated the building's current layout. The scans showed it had been sealed, not collapsed. Intentionally closed off. That discovery forced a difficult question back into the open. If the children and their teacher hadn't left the classroom, where could they have gone? The town had tried to move on after the disappearances. Vigils stopped drawing crowds. Posters yellowed and peeled away. Parents were left with only theories, none of them comforting. Some believed the teacher had orchestrated it, an elaborate escape, a breakdown no one had noticed. Others whispered about cults, traffickers, or secret tunnels stretching beyond town limits. A few insisted the children were still alive somewhere, hidden and waiting. But no evidence ever supported any version. The teacher herself had been well-liked, known for her calm voice and structured lessons. She had been white, in her late 30s, unmarried, with no record of instability or violence. Her academic interests, architecture, sound behavior in enclosed spaces, were considered odd but harmless. Nothing about her background suggested she would vanish with children entrusted to her care. Yet the chalkboard message remained unexplained. Investigators at the time had photographed it but never publicly released the exact wording. The spiral drawn beside it had been dismissed as classroom decoration. A child's idea. A coincidence. Now, standing in the same building 5 years later, the detective wondered if that assumption had been the first mistake. Permission was granted to access the subfloor. It took days to locate the exact entry point. Old maintenance diagrams hinted at an access panel that no longer existed. When workers finally breached the concrete beneath the assembly hall, the air that escaped was stale, untouched by circulation for decades. A ladder was lowered. The space below was larger than expected. Brick walls lined the perimeter, older than the rest of the structure. The mortar style matched construction techniques used long before the school officially opened. Electrical wiring ran along one side, outdated and inactive. The room had once been functional, then sealed. The first thing found wasn't bone. It was fabric. A child-sized jacket, folded unnaturally flat, as though placed rather than dropped. Nearby, a shoe. Then, another. Items arranged in a way that didn't match panic or chaos. Further inside, against the far wall, lay the remains. Multiple skeletons. Small frames clustered together. One adult-sized set of bones positioned slightly apart, closer to the wall, angled as if watching over the others. Time had stripped away identifying features, but there was no mistaking what they were. The missing class. The teacher. No signs of a collapse. No debris. No evidence the room had been entered accidentally. They had been brought here. And someone had sealed the space afterward. As forensic teams moved in, the detective noticed something etched faintly into the brick near the adult remains, a shallow marking, barely visible under years of dust. A spiral. Not drawn in chalk. Carved. And just beneath it, a message too eroded to read fully, except for 3 words that were still clear. The same words written on the classroom board 5 years earlier. And in that moment, it became impossible to believe the disappearance had been spontaneous. Someone had known this room existed. Someone had planned this. And whatever happened to the children hadn't ended when the door was closed. The room was sealed again before dawn. Not permanently, just enough to keep curious eyes away while investigators took control. Word of the discovery hadn't reached the public yet, but within the department, the tone had shifted from cautious interest to something heavier. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was a crime scene preserved by accident and time. Forensic lights revealed details that daylight would have missed. The skeletons were positioned deliberately. The children's remains were clustered close together, knees drawn inward, ribs angled toward the center of the group. None were scattered. None appeared to have tried to flee in different directions. That alone suggested something unsettling. Whatever happened down there, they had stayed together. The adult remains, the teacher, were different. Her skeleton was intact, aligned almost straight, one arm bent slightly at the elbow. She hadn't been placed with the children, but she also hadn't been separated entirely. The positioning suggested proximity without intimacy, authority without closeness. It raised the first uncomfortable possibility. She may not have been leading them. Initial examinations found no blunt force trauma on the visible bones. No fractures consistent with a collapse. No damage suggesting an explosion or fire. There were no restraints either, no rope fibers, no metal cuffs, nothing obvious to indicate the children had been physically bound. But the room itself told a different story. Along the walls were shallow grooves carved into the brick, repeating in uneven intervals. Some were too high for children to reach. Others were clustered low, near where the smallest bodies had been found. The markings didn't form words, but they weren't random scratches either. They followed patterns. Spirals. Interlocking lines. Symbols that appeared intentionally repeated, as though someone had traced them multiple times over the years. The chalkboard message upstairs suddenly felt less decorative. Investigators recovered personal effects next. Backpacks were stacked neatly near one corner. Inside them were school notebooks, crayons, worksheets, all untouched. Lunch containers still sealed. A few items were missing. No coats, no hats, no gloves. It was October when they vanished, and the weather had been cooling fast. Why would children remove outerwear before going underground? Air samples showed something else. Traces of chemical compounds embedded in the brick and soil. Not strong enough to be immediately lethal, but enough to induce disorientation, drowsiness, even mild auditory hallucinations when inhaled over time. Old building materials, the report suggested. But the concentration levels were uneven, higher near the center of the room, lower near the entrance. As if something had been released there deliberately. When the autopsy results began coming in, the findings complicated the narrative even further. Time of death could not be precisely determined, but evidence suggested the victims hadn't died immediately after entering the room. Bone positioning, soil compression, and the absence of chaotic disturbance implied they had remained alive for some period. Hours, possibly longer. There were no signs of starvation or dehydration severe enough to suggest days. Whatever caused their deaths happened relatively quickly, but not instantly. The teacher's remains showed something else entirely. A healed fracture in the wrist that predated the disappearance. Dental records confirmed her identity beyond doubt. Toxicology analysis, limited by time and decomposition, still detected trace residues in the soil beneath her skull that weren't present under the children. A different exposure. A different experience. That discovery cracked open a theory no one had wanted to voice aloud. What if the teacher hadn't brought the children there willingly? What if she had been coerced, or followed? The investigation widened. Construction records from the original school build were pulled. So were renovation permits from decades earlier. Inconsistencies surfaced quickly. Several sections of the basement had been altered during an expansion in the late 1980s, but blueprints didn't account for the room beneath the assembly hall. It wasn't a forgotten space. It was a removed one. A retired maintenance supervisor was eventually located. He had worked at the school briefly during the renovation period. His memory was shaky, but one detail stuck: a corridor beneath the building that workers were instructed not to enter. It wasn't on the plans, he said. But it was there. Brick-lined. Old. We were told to seal it off. No questions. When asked who gave the order, he couldn't remember a name. Just that the request hadn't come from the school district. It had come from outside. That revelation triggered a second wave of digging. The land the school sat on had a longer history than anyone realized. Before it was a school, the property had been used for municipal storage, records, equipment, even temporary detention during the early part of the century. Some structures had been torn down, others simply buried beneath new construction. There were rumors, unverified, of an underground chamber used for acoustic testing during the 1930s. A place designed to study sound resonance in enclosed spaces. The idea had been dismissed as folklore. Until investigators stood in the room and spoke. Voices didn't behave normally down there. Words echoed unevenly, sometimes returning distorted, sometimes not returning at all. Certain tones lingered longer than others. A low hum could be produced simply by standing still and breathing. The spiral carvings on the walls began to make a different kind of sense. The chalkboard message upstairs had been photographed again and enhanced digitally. The wording, still kept from the public, matched the phrasing etched faintly into the brick below, though the order was reversed. It wasn't a message written in the moment. It had been rehearsed. As the case regained momentum, families of the victims were notified. Some had waited 5 years for answers. Others had given up hope entirely. Grief returned with a violence that shocked even seasoned officers. One parent, reviewing the recovered notebooks, noticed something small and devastating. On the inside cover of several books, the same symbol appeared, drawn in pencil. A spiral. Some shaky, some careful. The children had seen it before that day. They had been shown. The teacher's academic background was re-examined. Her research notes, stored in a local archive, revealed an obsession with sound behavior in closed environments. Not mystical, not cultish, but intense. She believed certain architectural spaces could influence human perception more than previously understood. She had written about quiet zones. Places where sound didn't disappear but folded in on itself. There was no indication she had ever accessed the room beneath the school. But someone else had. Security logs from the school in 1995 were incomplete, but one anomaly stood out. A maintenance access door that had been unlocked for exactly 12 minutes during school hours on the day of the disappearance. No staff member admitted to opening it. No work order existed. 12 minutes was all it would take. The conclusion investigators reached was chilling in its simplicity. The children had not vanished into nothing. They had been led by someone who knew the building better than anyone should have. Someone who understood the room. Someone who disappeared from all records shortly after 1995. And to this day, no one has been able to say who that person was, or why they chose that class. The final sweep of the hidden room took place over 3 nights. By then, the existence of the chamber was no longer a secret inside the department, but it still hadn't reached the public. Investigators wanted certainty before exposure, something concrete enough to explain how 15 children and their teacher could be erased from a locked classroom and left undiscovered for 5 years beneath their own school. What they found instead complicated everything. Beneath a layer of compacted soil near the far wall, forensic teams uncovered a shallow trench running parallel to the brick. It wasn't deep enough to be structural and too narrow to be accidental. The soil inside it was disturbed differently from the rest of the room, suggesting repeated foot traffic. Someone had paced there. Near the trench, a small metal object was recovered, a keyring with 2 keys, heavily corroded but still intact. One matched an old maintenance door that no longer existed above ground. The other fit nothing in the building. Not anymore. The implication was obvious. Whoever brought the victims down there had a way out that wasn't through the classroom. And they had taken it. More unsettling details emerged as evidence was catalogued. On the brick behind where the teacher's remains were found, Faint tally-like markings appeared under ultraviolet light. Short vertical lines grouped in uneven clusters. Not days. Not counts of children. Breaths. Investigators brought in a behavioral analyst, hoping to understand the dynamics inside the room. His conclusion was cautious but disturbing. The children hadn't panicked immediately. There were no signs of frantic movement or escape attempts. No damage to the walls consistent with hysteria. Instead, the room suggested compliance. Calm. Almost instruction. The analyst proposed that the individual responsible had controlled the environment long enough to keep fear at bay, using voice, tone, or possibly sound manipulation within the chamber itself. The acoustics of the room would have amplified certain frequencies, dampened others. A person who understood that could command attention without force. Which brought the investigation back to one unresolved detail. The chalkboard upstairs. The message had been erased shortly after the disappearance, but not before being photographed. When linguists reviewed it again years later, they noted something overlooked in the original investigation. The phrasing wasn't something children commonly used, but it wasn't adult language either. It was instructional. Something that sounded like it had been repeated often enough to become familiar. The spiral symbol found throughout the room wasn't decorative. It corresponded to resonance diagrams used in early architectural acoustics, designs meant to visualize how sound moved in confined spaces. Someone had been experimenting. Not the teacher. Her notes made that clear. She theorized. She observed. She never practiced. Someone else had. Attention turned to a name that had never appeared in the case file before, not because it was hidden, but because it was missing entirely. A contractor involved in the late 1980s renovation had no follow-up records, no employment history after the project ended, no death certificate, no relocation data. He existed in invoices only. No photograph. No address. No known relatives. A ghost in the paperwork. Investigators attempted to trace him through secondary records, supply deliveries, equipment rentals, subcontractor lists. Every trail ended the same way, abruptly, around the time the sealed room would have been closed off. No evidence placed him at the school on the day of the disappearance. No evidence ruled him out either. As the case prepared to go public, families were given access to the findings. There were no comforting explanations. No clear timeline. No confession waiting to surface. Just the knowledge of where their children had been, and the certainty that someone had watched them disappear. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Media descended on the town. Former students came forward with memories they had never shared, stories of strange noises beneath the floors, moments when sound behaved oddly in certain hallways, teachers dismissing complaints about humming walls. One former janitor recalled being warned never to enter a blocked-off maintenance corridor. Another remembered a man he didn't recognize walking the building during renovations, always carrying a notebook, never speaking to anyone directly. None of it was enough to build a case. The hidden room was sealed again, this time permanently. The school was eventually closed. Demolition was considered, then abandoned. The building still stands, unused, its foundation reinforced around a space that should never have existed. Officially, the mystery was declared solved in one sense. The victims had been found. But the larger questions remain unanswered. Who led them underground? Why that class? Why that room? And perhaps most haunting of all, why did no one hear them? To this day, no suspect has ever been named. No charges filed. No motive confirmed. The spiral symbol has never been definitively explained, and the missing contractor remains unaccounted for. The final report concluded with a sentence that offered neither closure nor comfort. The disappearance was not an accident, and it was not spontaneous. The individual responsible demonstrated knowledge of the structure, the occupants, and the conditions required to ensure silence. Some mysteries end with answers. This one ended with a room full of them, hidden beneath a school, sealed by design, and discovered only when time itself gave up the secret. And even now, investigators agree on one thing. If that room had never been found, the class would still be missing. And no one would know how close they were the entire time. Now the real question people around still ask till date is, was this carefully planned by someone who knew the school too well? Or was there something even darker at play that never made it into the reports? If you have a theory, drop it in the comments because your perspective might catch something everyone else missed. And if stories like this keep you watching, please take a second to support the channel. Like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves deep dive true crime. It truly helps more than you know.